Welcome back, and thanks for staying with us. The African Investor Sovereign Wealth and Pension Fund Forum concluded deliberations yesterday after a three-day event. One of the important announcements made was the formation of an African Green Infrastructure Bank initiative. Now, to tell us more about the deliberations and this announcement is the African Investor Chairperson, Hubert Danso, who's also the Chairperson of the African Sovereign Wealth and Pension Fund Leaders Forum. Hubert, a very good morning, and thanks for making the time to talk to us.
Good morning to you, Desiree, and good morning to all the viewers. Always a pleasure to be here.
Thank you. The African Sovereign Wealth and Pension Fund Leaders Forum, what are its origins and what did the session that just ended yesterday mull over?
Well, thanks, Desiree. We as the African Sovereign Wealth and Pension Fund Leaders Forum essentially represent the continent's leading and largest pension and sovereign wealth fund CEOs, chairmen, and all of the chief investment officers. And we, as a community, always come together because we're driven by the important role that we need to play and are playing in deploying capital to support, the economic recovery from the tragedy of COVID. But also running in parallel, we have some other key objectives, which is also to, put the continent in a much more competitive position when it comes to addressing climate change and participating in the green economy. And then underlying that, we are all very committed to finding innovative and strategic ways to fund and support the implementation of the African continental free trade area. So one of the key outcomes from this initiative, and we've had a number of different interventions that we've been making since the onset of this health pandemic, which has created an economic crisis, which is running in parallel with this atmospheric pandemic called climate change. Our response as the African Sovereign Wealth and Pension Fund Leaders Forum was really to be able to touch on all of these elements through a strategic vehicle and initiative called the African Green Infrastructure Investment Bank, which predominantly recognizes that the green investment and the green finance market for the continent is very fragmented, and therefore has created a need to create a world-class international Pan-African investment platform that can mobilize, and this is important, that can mobilize institutional capital at scale. And I think it's really the at-scale element where we as the pension funds and the sovereign wealth fund community, both on the continent and internationally, can provide a unique contribution towards the recovery.
I hear what you're saying about the prerogative of the green economy, and we'll talk about that. But I want to ask you this. Pensions funds are a contentious issue at the moment, with conversations in South Africa especially taking place about dipping into these funds for non-intended purposes. What was the discourse in terms of the recognition of pension funds in the different African countries? And how do these CEOs feel about governments dipping into pension funds?
Yes, I think the focus here that we've been able to advance is actually South Africa represents an important and interesting model which is being evaluated by the rest of the continent, particularly in the context of the latest revisions to Regulation 28, which make and talk specifically to infrastructure as an investable asset class and the level of allocations that can be applied to these issues. So I think what we've seen before is very much a, let's see what government wants to prioritize, and then we will determine whether we want to participate. But under the African Union's 5% infrastructure investment agenda, which is a pact between African pension funds and African sovereign wealth funds, a lot of these challenges and a lot of the misunderstandings around the perception of prescribed assets, in other words, pension funds being forced to go into non-productive or effective investments, has really been addressed, because the 5% agenda and the partnerships that we now have as pension fund and the sovereign wealth fund community with governments, and this has been endorsed at the African Union heads of state level, is that we come together to create and co-develop these particular transactions so that they have much more prospect of meeting our investment criteria. I mean, after all, a number of government leaders, civil society representatives as well, are actually beneficiaries of the funds. So no one has an interest in, putting their own pension at risk by investing in non-productive or commercial assets. So we've been able to balance the two here, where we can, meet this new trend, which is where our future generations and the current retirees and members of funds should and want to enjoy the benefits of their pension funds now, with good infrastructure, a good climate. We want to be able to recover, use our sort of investment capital and our long-term planning to be able to create a stimulus and a recovery program. Because after all, we are not, we don't have the privilege of some of the other OECD markets that are throwing trillions of dollars behind their stimulus. So I think there's a very clear and collegiate understanding between our pension fund and our sovereign wealth fund industry, as well as our governments, about how we can work together shoulder to shoulder to actually fund the recovery. And we believe that the African Green Infrastructure Investment Bank initiative that we're tabling has the potential to do that. In a modest way, we'll start with initially raising $3 to $5 billion from our own African institutional investors and governments. And we are very confident, based on the feedback that we've had already, that we will be able to mobilize in the region of about $20 billion from G7 and G20 investment partners. I think it's very important to note that the relationships that existed, public sector, private sector, institutional investment community, civil society, prior to the pandemic, have changed fundamentally. In the private sector now, we're talking about stakeholder capitalism. And in the institutional investment community, we're looking at very clear instruments and platforms that can have an impact. And if you look at the fact that the continent has a need of $100 billion per annum for the next 10 years to address energy poverty, these types of partnerships, instruments like the African Green Infrastructure Investment Bank are being very warmly welcomed, and it's a real partnership approach that we're looking to take to address these both challenges as well as opportunities.
I like that you're talking about raising funds and partnerships. I want to ask you this: when there is an African bank and recently the BRICS Bank, what prompts the creation of a separate Pan-African Green Infrastructure Bank? And just tell us a bit, for the purpose of our visa, I know it's a global conversation, but what is green infrastructure?
Well, essentially, we are looking at infrastructure, renewable energy type infrastructure. We're looking at, using the endowment that we've been blessed with as a continent to really ensure that we can keep up with the $7+ trillion global green economy. We're looking to ensure that, as we know, regrettably, every 4 to 6 years, we're going to have another pandemic, and we need resilient and climate-friendly infrastructure in place to address that. And so we're really looking to leverage our endowment that has enormous renewable energy potential from the continent, which is 10 terawatts of solar, 350 gigawatts of hydro, 15 gigawatts of geothermal. And it's all based on the fact that a lot of the banks in the market have green infrastructure as part of their mandate. But when you're looking to mobilize or address a need of $100 billion a year, you need to build a very dedicated, professionally run, commercially focused institution that can support all of our countries and work with all of our countries' different infrastructure banks and pension funds to be able to commercially and strategically invest in the recovery in a green and climate-friendly manner. So the point of distinction is that this is an exclusively green-focused renewable energy and other infrastructure and tech-related climate-friendly infrastructure-related institution. And it's really solely focused on building that institutional knowledge, capacity, and capital, to address that. And also, there are trillions of dollars globally, and there's a pool of about $100 trillion of global institutional capital, it is always going to be focused on, looking at climate-friendly and ESG, environmental, social, and governance-oriented investments. So we also want to get in front of that trend globally to say, look, on the continent,
Hubert?
the social component of how we transition into a fully green and climate-friendly economy
it's also
needs to be done our way.
It's also a very complex conversation that can't be finished in one interview, so we hope to have you back another time. But thanks for coming through to tell us about this development. Hubert Danso is the chairperson of Africa Investor and also the chairperson of the African Sovereign Wealth and Pension Fund Leaders Forum. Thank you so much for coming through. Let's take a look at your latest weather.